I just wanted to start by not assuming that everyone is familiar with the word biodiversity. It simply means the variety of life on Earth, what Charles Darwin called the richness of life, the great 19th century naturalist. And I'm going to start by talking inevitably about the scale of the crisis. So in less than 80 years, global capitalism has created a biodiversity crisis on a scale never before seen in human history. If the causes of this catastrophe are not challenged, we are set to lose around 1 million out of an estimated 8 million animal and plant species on Earth, 5.5 million of which are insects. Many will die out before they are ever identified or understood for their vital role in our ecosystems. As I said, we are losing the richness of life. In Charles Darwin's words, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Now, extinction is not in itself a crisis. It's part of evolution. The geological record contains 5 mass extinctions, and many species died out because they could not adapt to changing conditions, such as the oxygen levels changing. And obviously, we're most familiar with the accidental extinction of the megafauna about 62 million years ago. But apart from that accidental death of the dinosaurs, in evolutionary terms, many species are just not successful. But the loss of species that we are experiencing now is not natural. Some people are calling it the 6th extinction. It is a convergence of pollution, habitat loss and degradation, disease, ocean acidification, and warming water linked to climate change. It's being driven by emissions from capitalism's relentless burning of fossil fuels, and it's underpinned and exacerbated by capitalism's only reason to exist, the accumulation of profit. Since the Second World War, capitalism has managed to destroy an entire geological epoch, the Holocene. This is the geological moment that life has inhabited since the last ice age ended roughly 10,000 years ago. And the Holocene was warm enough to hold the highest level of species diversity in the Earth's history. The new geological epoch, named Anthropocene, and it's called that because human activity is the dominant influence on climate and our environment. But we should be very clear that Anthropocene does not describe the activities of all humans, but the behavior of capitalists on a global scale and capitalist modes of production. And worrying about the extinction of various species is not new. So, for instance, in the late 1980s, there was a huge resurgence in concern about species loss, and some charismatic species became emblems for this crisis. People may remember pandas and, of course, whales. And it is debatable whether, in fact, pandas are a evolutionary dead end, but obviously, the Chinese state has intervened, and with luck, we may all get our own personal panda in future. That's my personal choice of pet. And since then, of course, the crisis of biodiversity has really been associated with neoliberalism, this new phase of capitalism where the priority is focused on the deregulation of industries and the privatization of public sector. People were so worried, scientists were so worried about the crisis of biodiversity in the 1980s that the United Nations set up the Convention on Biological Diversity, in a similar way to COP, to the Convention of the Parties meetings. And we had the 15th Convention on Biological Diversity last year. Big fanfare about it, and the first international agreement to protect biodiversity. And it was claimed that biodiversity loss would be dramatically held back by this process. And we'll come back to that a bit later. We should say that the figures for how many species there are on Earth are contested. There are around 50 definitions of species, and some do and some don't include microbes. So there's a whole another meeting there about what is or isn't a species. But I want to talk about now, the most quoted figure is 8.7 million species estimated on Earth at the moment. And this figure was come up with by, came up rather, by the Census on Marine Life in 2011. And out of those 8.7 million species, about 5.5 of them are probably insects. And I want to talk now a bit about insects because they are a prime example of how capitalism has affected biodiversity. Insects have existed for 479 million years, which means, of course, that they have survived all previous bouts of mass extinction. When an insect population is destroyed, a large number of birds, lizards, and mammals that rely on those insects cannot breed successfully. That is the most obvious conclusion about insects being reduced. This partly explains why in the US and Canada, you have lost roughly 29% of your birds since the 1970s. That's not individual species, that's the 29% of the mass of the whole. In Europe, France has lost around 30% of its farmland birds since the 1980s. And in Britain, similar species, around 56% of those numbers have been lost. And they include things like skylarks and partridges, and that used to be extremely common in fields and are very difficult to see in Britain now. Apart from being food for all of those birds, insects are pollinators, pest controllers, water purifiers. They break down organic matter with worms and microorganisms, including bacteria, to form fertile soil. So the destruction of insects is actually wrecking the basis of our food chains. Insect loss is linked to rising temperatures and pollution, but the biggest driver is the destruction of their habitats. And this has been exacerbated by the global use of glyphosate weed killers and neonicotinoid insecticides. One example of the use of the effect of neonicotinoid compounds is that they appear to interfere with bees' ability to find their way home. And some forms of neonicotinoid compounds appear to be addictive, which means that bees actually seek out the chemicals that are linked to colony collapse disorder. Glyphosate and neonicotinoid insecticides were developed in the 1980s to replace the previous generation of even more poisonous pesticides, including DDT. And many people may have heard of the 1962 book, Silent Spring, by Rachel Carson, which really, it's a fantastic book. I really recommend reading it. It describes the appalling destruction of birds, invertebrates, and fish as enormous quantities of pesticides were dumped on farmlands, parks, and gardens in both North America and Europe to eradicate some real or imagined pest. Now, these products were regulated. but they still manage to poison and kill hundreds of people every year, because even in small quantities, they become super concentrated as they move up through the food chain. But these chemicals were highly profitable, and agrochemical industries have fought very hard to keep them in use. Just as Monsanto, now owned by the giant pharmaceutical company Bayer, has fought to keep glyphosates and neonicotinoids from being blamed for the mass destruction of pollinators, especially bees and butterflies. It's not just Monsanto or Bayer. Farming corporations, our National Farmers Union has also resisted the ban on neonicotinoids in Britain and Europe. And it's very interesting that when Bayer finally completed the purchase of Monsanto, I think it was 2018 when they finally did that, they immediately dropped the name Monsanto, which the company had the name for 117 years, but thanks to the campaigns and the resistance to industrial farming and some of the processes, they had become a byword for genetically modified crops and driving farmers into crippling debt. So Monsanto has gone, but the problems remain. I noticed that I think you've had the same problem in Canada, where there is considerable resistance to banning all of the neonicotinoid compounds. We now know that industrial farming is the origin of the pandemics. It's of so many diseases. It's the origin of the COVID-19 virus, and now avian or bird flu. So the agrochemical industries are behind the massive expansion of artificial nitrate fertilizers that get poured onto exhausted arable land and are linked to the growing dead zones in coastal waters. As those nitrates and soil are washed away in heavy rain, too little oxygen remains to support many life forms, and inevitably more expensive artificial nitrates must be added to farmland to make it profitable. This is how you can see that the system just deals with the problem by adding more of the problem. I want to say something about capitalism's drive for profit and how it has really created the metabolic rift, in John Bellamy Foster's expression, between human society and nature. And Karl Marx, 19th century revolutionary, in Capital, his enormous book on how capital worked, there are lots of really good little examples of how you could see that rift developing. So for hundreds of years, London, our capital in Britain, was surrounded by market gardens, and all of the human waste, all of the excrement was removed overnight, taken out of the city and the surrounding towns, and it was taken to the market gardens and the small farms surrounding the city and dumped on the soil as fertilizer. The difference that came up with capitalism in the 19th century is that it was more profitable to individual capitalists to dump that excrement in the River Thames. And so that's what they did. And he described it as the irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism. So if we're going to have a sustainable cycle, we have a situation where nutrients are taken out of the soil by plants. They have to be returned to the soil. calcium and phosphorus in bones and teeth, nitrogen in our proteins, sulfur, potassium, magnesium, all the other elements inside animals and ourselves are first taken up from the soil by plants. And so we have a situation now where if industrial scale destruction of biodiversity and climate change are not challenged, and if that rift is not begun to be healed, large areas of the earth will become uninhabitable as the ecological networks we rely on collapse. We had some very sharp examples of this before the pandemic. The catastrophic bushfires in Australia and the US, which are now more or less annual features, the floods in Indonesia. They all show how quickly this process can develop. And none of these things are entirely natural. You know, the forests in Australia are an extraordinary example of evolution managed by human beings into a landscape where fire is managed and plants have evolved to use fire to germinate. But because we have this rift now between human beings managing the land, and actually they don't. It's as simple as that. Most indigenous communities in Australia are not able to manage the land in the way they know they could. That's why you get these catastrophic fires. It's not a natural process as such. Now we also know that in Europe, before the Ukraine war, the war between, well, Russia invading Ukraine, which is a year old now, we know that climate change had overtaken war as a major driver of human movement. And we know this is only going to get worse. And we know that the ruling class is going to use racism to divide people. They already are. We have the extraordinary situation in Britain. We have the most diverse government we have ever had. And they are the people driving racism, continually trying to brutalize migrants and refugees. But we have had some profound successes in pushing them back. And this, I think, shows how climate activists, activists for climate justice, also have to understand they have to be anti-racist activists. Now, excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink. Capitalism is constantly adapting and looking for solutions to the problems it has created, but these are completely inadequate, as we saw with glyphosates and neonicotinoids replacing DDT, because they appeared to be safe initially because they didn't kill people. One of the other problems capitalism has is that is mining for very specific minerals and metals required for high-tech production. And this has resulted in polymetallic nodule mining from the seafloor, the seabed. And one of the things about this is a relatively new process, and it is at least as destructive as fracking, but of course people can't see it. And what it involves is to mine these polymetallic nodules. You have to remove effectively the seabed, quite a few inches of it going down. And then you can strip out whatever, these polymetallic nodules, you can take them out. And the problem is that seabed takes 20,000 years to form, and it takes a matter of weeks to destroy. It will probably kill the species that rely on that topsoil. Many of them, along with all the other species, have not been described or named, and we don't yet understand their role in their ecosystem. But as far as capitalism is concerned, this is a technological solution to another problem they have. There are many others like this: iron fertilization of the oceans to create algal blooms that will supposedly sink to the ocean floor and trap carbon. Don't try that at home. Now, remember the 15th UN Convention on Biological Diversity and its first international agreement to protect biodiversity. Well, part of their solution is to hand over vast tracts of land and sea to nature. So this clearly understands human beings to be the problem. So we will simply protect these areas and human beings will not be allowed in them, is the idea. The problem with that is that human beings are inextricably part of the natural world. Nature is the basis of our survival and well-being, as much as any other life form on Earth. Karl Marx, again, summed this up very well. He said, and in this quote, he uses the term man, by which he meant mankind, all people. Man lives from nature, i.e. nature is his body, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. To say that man's physical and mental life is linked to nature simply means that nature is linked to itself, for man is part of nature. And Darwin has a lovely expression for this when he talks about an entangled bank and species interdependence on each other. So technological solutions and proposals such as handing over huge chunks of the land and sea over to reservations can actually make the problem worse. But I think they are also attempts to deflect popular anger and worry at environmental degradation. And you can see this because ordinary people give millions of pounds or dollars annually to conservation organisations, many of which are obsessed with promoting the value of nature in money terms and saving individual species, which is equally problematic. And this comes under the heading loosely of natural capital. So we can see biodiversity summits and the NGO organisations, they are conflicted over this. They both pessimistically see no realistic alternative, and of course they depend on the concept of natural capital for funding. And thinking back to the great upsurge of climate student strikes before the pandemic, they really showed just how well informed they were and how serious they were. They understood natural capital and carbon trading and offsetting related accounting devices. They understood them for the poverty of ambition and refusal to challenge capitalism's drive for profit. In the same way, you can see that attempting to save an individual species is also missing the point. The problem is systemic, and if ecosystems are collapsing, which they are, it's going to be impossible to save individual species, no matter how much money is poured into saving that individual species. And we've had some, well, it would be funny if it weren't so tragic, examples. In Ireland, the government announced that the contribution of earthworms per year was worth 723 million euros. That is the value of earthworms. And it may almost seem ridiculous, but the problem is that in a system of natural capital under capitalism, when you've decided what those earthworms are worth, you can then start to break down pockets of land that you may want to develop as a capitalist. And you can decide, right, there is, X size of land. I want to develop it. I know I'm going to destroy its biodiversity, and therefore I can pay XYZ amount of money to fix the problem. I will cut down trees, but I will plant other trees. And we can see this, you can see this all over the world at the moment. And we've had some extraordinarily stark examples in Britain recently where the HS2 high-speed train has been going through areas of outstanding biodiversity and sensitive landscapes. And the problem is, when you consider that you can pay your way out of the problem, you get a situation where a 250-year-old pear tree, or perhaps it was 230 years, sorry, I may be misremembering, it was cut down on the basis that this tree could be, other trees would be replanted. And it wasn't cut down for any major necessity. It was actually so that it would create a small car park for a couple of trucks. But any environmentalist, any naturalist understands that the only way of replacing the ecosystem of a 250-year-old tree is another 250-year-old tree. You can't simply plant a bunch of saplings and solve the problem. We should also be clear that since 1992, no targets that have been put in place to halt climate change, to protect biodiversity, none of them have been met. Okay, so we cannot solve the crisis created by capitalism by applying the theory and practice of capitalism to ecosystems and biodiversity, and we are running out of time. And this situation really can look hopeless when at least $2 trillion worth of investment in fossil fuels has been made since 2015. The Paris Agreement in 2015 agreed to keep the Earth from heating to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. And yet since then, emissions have just gone up and up. And now the Saudi oil giant Aramco, they have just announced a record profit of $161.1 billion for 2022. America's ExxonMobil has announced $55.7 billion of profit, and Britain's company Shell has reported $39.9 billion. So this is the scale of the problem. The real solutions to climate change and biodiversity crisis lie in transforming our relationship to the natural world. And the good news is that we have some examples and evidence that damaged environments can be repaired really quite quickly. And I don't know if you have seen the documentary, The Biggest Little Farm, but if you haven't, I really recommend it. It's absolutely joyful. The project is some people, they do some fundraising, crowdfunding rather, and they buy a modern Dust Bowl farm in California. And in 7 years, they transform it into a rich soiled productive farm. They do this by careful planting. Planting around the terraces, the natural contours of their hills. They add a huge amount of organic fertilizers, mostly rotting horse manure. California's got plenty of that. They add a mixture of domesticated animal species. They do habitat restitution for wild species. And in this process, the grey dust becomes dark brown loam. Pests like snails and gophers, they were managed by becoming food for ducks, owls, and foxes. And the greatest testament to this work is when in California they get cloudbursts that dump vast amounts of rain very quickly on a small area. Their farm is the one where the soil holds firm and doesn't wash away. None of it is damaged. So we don't need to despair. That's the lesson of this. We have the technology, we have the knowledge to fix the problem. But obviously, capitalists and their friends in government are not going to give up their investments and profits willingly. So we have to challenge and ultimately break capitalism's grip on our world and ultimately replace capitalism with a socialist system. When we do that, we can have a rational food system and use of nature, and therefore rewilding and other forms of biodiversity conservation are much more likely to succeed because they will be democratic and rational in the approach to food production and our use, in inverted commas, of nature and natural resources, because we won't force other life forms to compete with profit, which is exactly what we're doing now. This is how we could repair our relationship with our planet. This is how we could develop our ecological understanding and rid ourselves of the muck of ages. And this is how we could shape a sustainable future and save life on Earth. Thanks very much.